I should have listened to the warnings. They told me the house was cursed, that no one should ever live there. But I didn't believe in ghosts or curses. St. Osyth was just an old village with old stories, nothing more. But the moment I stepped into the cage, the air seemed to change. Thicker, heavier, almost suffocating. I shrugged it off, convinced it was just my imagination. The cage was a beautiful, if eerie, place. Nestled in the heart of Essex, it had the charm of a bygone era, with its stone walls, low ceilings, and narrow, winding corridors. I fell in love with it the moment I saw it, oblivious to the sinister past hidden within its walls. It was only later that I learned it had been a medieval prison, a place where accused witches were held, tortured, and eventually sent to the gallows. But by then it was too late. The house was mine. The first few nights were uneventful. The silence of the village was almost calming, the kind that made you feel safe. But that comfort was shattered on the fourth night. It started with the sound of footsteps. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. They crept along the hallway outside my bedroom, stopping just outside the door. I held my breath, straining to hear more. There was nothing, just silence. The following night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, accompanied by a scratching sound, like nails on wood. I convinced myself it was just the house settling, or perhaps a mouse in the walls. But then, as I lay there, my eyes wide open in the darkness, the door to my room creaked open just an inch. I could feel a presence, something standing in the doorway, watching me. My heart pounded in my chest, but I was too terrified to move. In the morning, the door was shut as if nothing had happened. I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream, but I knew it wasn't. The feeling of being watched stayed with me throughout the day, a constant shadow lurking at the back of my mind. The activity escalated quickly after that. Objects began to move on their own, books falling off shelves, chairs sliding across the floor. The smell of burning, like singed hair, would fill the rooms without warning. And the footsteps, they followed me everywhere, no matter where I was in the house. At night, I could hear whispering, faint voices echoing through the walls, their words unintelligible but filled with malice. It wasn't until I found the cellar that I understood the true horror of what I had invited into my life. I discovered the entrance purely by accident. A loose floorboard in the kitchen that revealed a hidden staircase leading down into darkness. I was drawn to it, compelled by something I couldn't explain, as if the house itself wanted me to find it. The air in the cellar was thick with damp and decay, and the walls were lined with old rusted shackles. This was where they had kept the accused, where they had been chained, tortured, and left to rot. I could almost hear their screams, feel their pain. But that wasn't the worst of it. In the far corner of the room, hidden in the shadows, was a small iron cage. It was no bigger than a closet, its bars blackened with age, but there was something about it. Something wrong. The air around it was cold, unnaturally so, and I could feel a presence within, something ancient and malevolent. That night I dreamt of the witches. They were there, in the cage, their eyes hollow and filled with rage. They whispered to me, their voices filled with hatred and sorrow, begging for release, cursing me for disturbing their rest. I woke up drenched in sweat, the room freezing cold despite the summer heat. The whispering didn't stop with the dream. It followed me into the waking world, growing louder and more insistent with each passing day. Then the violence began. Objects weren't just moving. They were being hurled across the room, smashing into walls with terrifying force. The scratching became a constant noise, coming from inside the walls, underneath the floorboards, always just out of reach. But the worst was the apparition. I first saw it in the reflection of the bathroom mirror. A figure standing behind me, shrouded in darkness, its face obscured but its eyes glowing with an unholy light. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The figure began appearing more frequently, always in the corner of my vision, always watching. It never moved, never spoke, but its presence filled me with a dread so profound it was like ice water in my veins. I tried to leave, but every time I did, something stopped me. A sudden illness, a locked door, a lost key. It was as if the house wouldn't let me go, as if it needed me to stay. The final straw came when I woke up one night to find the bed shaking violently, as if something beneath it was trying to tear its way through the mattress. I ran out of the house that night, not daring to look back. I've been staying at a friend's place since then, but the cage hasn't let me go. I can still hear the whispers in my sleep, still feel the cold presence watching me, and in the back of my mind, I know I'll have to go back. I have to finish what I started, to find out what's inside that cage and why it won't let me leave. But deep down I'm terrified. I know that whatever is in that house, whatever is trapped inside that cage, is waiting for me. And when I go back, it will be ready. I resisted going back to the cage for as long as I could. The memories of what had happened there clung to me like a shadow, haunting my every thought. But the pull of that place was too strong, like an invisible tether that refused to let me escape. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cage, felt the cold air seeping through its iron bars, and heard the whispers of those long-dead souls begging for release, or worse, for revenge. I tried to distract myself with the mundane. Work, friends, anything to keep my mind occupied. But the more I tried to distance myself, the stronger the pull became. It was as if the cage was calling out to me, demanding my return. The dreams returned too, more vivid and horrifying than before. In them, I saw the witches, twisted, emaciated figures with hollow eyes, their skin marred by the torture they had endured centuries ago. They would reach out to me through the bars of the cage, their fingers impossibly long, their voices a cacophony of pain and anger. It was during one of these nightmares that I saw something new. Something that sent a shiver of pure terror down my spine. There was another figure, standing in the shadows just beyond the witches. It was taller, more menacing, and unlike anything I had seen before. Its face was hidden in darkness, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and predatory. The witches seemed to cower in its presence, their whispers growing frantic and desperate as the figure moved closer to the cage. And then I woke up drenched in sweat, the taste of blood in my mouth from where I had bitten my tongue in fear. That was when I knew I had to go back. There was something in the cage that needed to be confronted, something that was growing stronger the longer I stayed away. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The day I returned was overcast, the sky a dull gray that seemed to suck the color out of the world. The village was eerily quiet as I made my way back to the house, my footsteps echoing on the cobblestone streets. The cage loomed ahead, its dark stone walls seeming even more foreboding than before. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound reverberating through the empty halls like a warning. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay and something else. Something acrid like burnt flesh. I hesitated in the doorway, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave and never return. But I couldn't. I had to know what was waiting for me in the cellar. The house was unnervingly silent as I made my way down the narrow corridor toward the kitchen, where the hidden entrance to the cellar lay. The scratching sounds had stopped, replaced by a heavy stillness that made my skin crawl. Every step I took felt like a step deeper into the abyss, closer to whatever malevolent force had taken hold of this place. The floorboard in the kitchen creaked as I lifted it, revealing the dark stairway beneath. I hesitated for a moment, peering into the pitch-black void below before forcing myself to descend. The air grew colder with each step, my breath visible in the dim light of the torch I carried. The cellar was just as I had left it, damp, musty, the iron cage looming in the corner like a beast waiting to pounce. But something was different this time. The air was charged, heavy with a palpable sense of dread. As I approached the cage, I could feel the presence again, stronger than ever. It was as if the very walls were closing in on me, pressing down, suffocating. My hand shook as I reached out to touch the bars, icy cold beneath my fingertips. And then I saw it, the shadowy figure from my dreams standing just beyond the cage, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It was real, no longer just a figment of my nightmares. The witch's whispers grew louder, frantic, and pleading as the figure stepped closer. I could feel its malevolence, a dark, twisted energy that seemed to pulsate through the room. It spoke then, a low guttural voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The words incomprehensible but filled with malice. My body froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, held in place by the sheer terror that gripped me. The figure reached out, its hand, if it could be called that, passing through the bars of the cage, the air around it distorting, as if reality itself was being twisted by its presence. And then, with a sudden violent force, I was thrown backward, crashing into the stone wall. Pain exploded in my chest, but I barely registered it. The cage was now empty, the shadowy figure gone, leaving behind only the suffocating darkness and the lingering echo of its voice. The witch's whispers had stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the world had ended. But I knew this was only the beginning. Whatever had been in that cage, whatever had been released, was now free. And it was coming for me. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I needed to get out, to escape before it was too late. But as I turned to leave, the door to the cellar slammed shut with a deafening crash, the sound reverberating through the darkness like a death knell. And then, from the depths of the cellar, I heard it. A low, menacing growl that sent a shiver of pure terror down my spine. The cage had been opened, and there was no escape. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by the growl that seemed to echo from every corner of the cellar. It was deep, guttural, and inhuman. Nothing that should exist in the realm of the living. My heart pounded in my chest, the blood roaring in my ears, drowning out everything but the sound of that monstrous noise. Then the growl stopped, replaced by an even more terrifying silence. The air was thick, charged with something I couldn't see but could feel pressing against my skin, like invisible hands reaching out to drag me into the darkness. I forced myself to move, my legs heavy with dread, and back toward the staircase. My eyes never left the shadowy corners of the cellar, every nerve in my body on edge, expecting the creature to lunge at me at any moment. The steps creaked under my weight as I ascended, the sound jarring in the suffocating quiet. But when I reached the top, the door was still closed, as if it had sealed itself shut. I pushed against it, my panic rising when it wouldn't budge. The wood was cold, almost icy to the touch, and no matter how hard I shoved, it remained stubbornly locked. The sense of being trapped, of the walls closing in on me, grew stronger with every passing second. Then I heard it again. The growl, closer this time, rumbling from the depths below. It was joined by the faint sound of chains rattling, a metallic clinking that sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through me. I spun around, my back pressed against the unyielding door, my torch flickering as the shadows seemed to gather and coalesce at the bottom of the stairs. Something was down there, something that had been locked away for centuries, forgotten, but never truly gone. And now it was awake, hungry, and filled with an ancient rage. My breath came in shallow gasps as I fumbled in the darkness, desperately searching for anything that could help me escape. My fingers brushed against something cold and metal. A key. My heart leaped as I grabbed it, forcing myself to stay calm as I slid it into the lock. It turned with a loud click, and the door swung open with a creak that seemed deafening in the silence. I bolted up the stairs, the cold air of the house hitting me like a slap to the face. The door to the cellar slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the floor, but I didn't look back. I ran through the darkened corridors, the only light coming from my flickering torch, the shadows seeming to stretch and twist as if they were alive. But no matter how fast I ran, the house seemed to stretch on endlessly. The familiar rooms and hallways warped and twisted, becoming a nightmarish labyrinth that had no end. I could hear the growl behind me, closer now, echoing through the halls. The sound of chains dragging across the floor followed me, growing louder with every step. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run any further, I found myself back in the main hall, the front door looming ahead. My salvation. I sprinted toward it, my hand outstretched. But as my fingers grazed the handle, a force yanked me backward with such violence that I was thrown to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest as I spun around to face whatever had pulled me back. There, standing in the center of the hall, was the figure from the cellar. It was more solid now, its form almost human, but distorted, as if something monstrous was trying to break free from within. Its eyes were hollow voids, blacker than the darkest night, and they locked onto mine with a malevolence that froze the blood in my veins. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its footsteps echoing in the silence. The temperature plummeted, my breath visible in the cold air, and the walls seemed to pulse with a sickly light, like the beating of a diseased heart. I was trapped, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The door was right there, but I knew I'd never make it in time. The figure raised its hand, and the room filled with the stench of decay, of rot and death. The air grew thick, choking, as if the very atmosphere was tainted by the creature's presence. I felt a pressure on my chest, like invisible hands squeezing the life out of me, forcing me to my knees. The figure loomed over me, its hollow eyes boring into mine, and I knew it was going to kill me, slowly, painfully. But then, just as I felt the last of my strength ebbing away, a voice, faint, barely more than a whisper, echoed through the hall. It was different from the witches' voices, calmer, almost soothing, but with an edge of steel that cut through the oppressive darkness. The figure hesitated, its head tilting as if listening. The voice grew stronger, more insistent, and the figure seemed to recoil, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. I could feel the pressure on my chest ease, the air becoming clearer, less suffocating. The figure let out a low, guttural growl, its form twisting and writhing as if in pain. And then, with a final ear-splitting scream, it vanished. The air in the hall suddenly still, the darkness retreating. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my mind reeling from what had just happened. But I knew this wasn't over. Whatever had just saved me, whatever had driven that creature away, it was still here, watching, waiting. The cage had more secrets, more horrors yet to be revealed. And the voice that had saved me, wasn't done with me yet. The voice stayed with me, whispering in the shadows, a constant presence that both comforted and unnerved me. It was a woman's voice, soft yet firm, with an authority that demanded to be heard. At first it guided me, leading me away from the traps the house had set, but as the hours passed, it became more insistent, urging me to return to the cellar, to the cage that had started this nightmare. I resisted at first, terrified of what I might find down there. But the voice persisted, growing louder, more commanding, until it was all I could hear. It wasn't just guiding me anymore. It was pulling me, dragging me back down into the depths of the house, to the very source of the horror that had been unleashed. With trembling hands, I opened the door to the cellar once more. The cold air rushed out to greet me, carrying with it the scent of decay and something far more sinister. The voice urged me on, its tone now laced with a desperation that mirrored my own fear. I descended the stairs, each step feeling like a march toward my doom. The cellar was as I had left it, the iron cage looming in the darkness, a blackened relic of a tortured past. But there was something different this time. A faint glow emanating from within the cage, a sickly green light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The voice grew stronger, guiding me toward it, and I found myself stepping closer, drawn to the light despite the dread pooling in my gut. As I approached, the light flickered, revealing something within the cage, an object I hadn't seen before. It was a small blackened book, its cover etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and twist in the dim light. The air around it was heavy, oppressive, and the closer I got, the more I could feel the malevolent energy radiating from it. The voice whispered urgently now, telling me to open the book, to read the words within. My hand shook as I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the cage before I hesitated, fear gnawing at my resolve. But the voice grew louder, more insistent, until I could no longer resist. I grasped the book, pulling it free from the cage's confines, and the instant I did, the light vanished, plunging the cellar into darkness. The silence was deafening, the air thick with anticipation as I opened the book. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the words, those terrible ancient words, burned themselves into my mind. They spoke of rituals, of sacrifices, of binding spirits to this world, trapping them in eternal torment. And then at the very end, a single name, scrawled in blood-red ink, Elizabeth Clark. The realization hit me like a blow. Elizabeth Clark, one of the women accused of witchcraft, tortured, and executed here in St. Osyth. Her spirit had been trapped in the cage for centuries, her suffering feeding the dark energy that now consumed the house. But she wasn't the only one. The figure, the malevolent entity that had attacked me, it wasn't Elizabeth. It was something else, something that had been drawn to her pain, feeding on it, growing stronger until it had taken control. The voice in my head, it was Elizabeth. She had been guiding me, trying to warn me, to help me end this. The book, with its dark rituals, held the key to releasing her spirit, to ending the curse that had plagued this house for so long. But it came with a cost, a terrible price that had to be paid. The voice whispered the ritual to me, the words forming in my mind as if I had known them all along. I recited them, my voice trembling, the air around me growing colder with each word. The darkness seemed to press in closer, the walls of the cellar closing in as the ritual took hold. And then, with a final shuddering breath, the voice was gone. The oppressive weight lifted, the air growing still, almost peaceful. I let out a sigh of relief, believing that it was over, that I had freed her and myself from the nightmare. But then a new sound filled the cellar, a soft mocking laughter that sent a chill down my spine. It was coming from behind me, from the very spot where the figure had vanished. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The figure was back, but it had changed. It was no longer the shadowy, indistinct form that had haunted me before. It was more solid now, more real, and as it stepped into the dim light, I could finally see its face. It was me, but not just me. My face was twisted into a grotesque mockery, my eyes hollow and lifeless, my mouth stretched into a wide, malevolent grin. The realization hit me with sickening clarity. The ritual hadn't freed Elizabeth. It had freed the entity that had been trapped with her, the thing that had fed on her pain and now wanted more. The figure stepped closer, its hollow eyes locking onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It reached out, its cold fingers brushing against my cheek, and I realized too late what I had done. The entity hadn't been banished. It had been given a new vessel, me. I tried to move, to scream, to do anything, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped, paralyzed as the entity began to merge with me, its darkness seeping into my very soul. My vision blurred, the room spinning around me as I felt myself slipping away, my consciousness fading into the void. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of my own voice, echoing in the darkness, twisted and distorted by the entity that now controlled me. The cage had won, and I was its new prisoner.